Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, founder and president of the Pixel Project, and I'm moderating the 12th Google Hangout session of the 5th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through the Read for Pixels campaign, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 15 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking, as well as help us reveal the first mystery celebrity male role model portrait in our Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Review campaign. So we'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. And you can find out about the Pixel Project by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. Now, we have a very special guest today. We're having a live discussion and Q&A session with science fiction and fantasy author Fonda Lee. Fonda is the author of JADE City, which was a Nebula Award finalist and named a Best Book of 2017 by NPR, Barnes & Noble, Sci-Fi Wire, and others. Her award-winning young adult science fiction novels include Zero Boxer, EXO, and Crossfire. Fonda is a recovering corporate strategist, black belt martial artist, and an action movie aficionado living in Portland, Oregon. Fonda has also generously donated 3 lovely treats to the stash of author goodies we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So the first one is a Greenbone Saga book bundle, and this includes a signed and personalized first edition trade paperback of JADE City, and I'm going to put Fonda on screen so she can show that. Yay! And a signed and personalized advanced reader copy of Jade War once it's available. I think you've revealed the cover this week, right? It's all
cover was revealed, yes. And hopefully the advanced copy will be out early next year, is my guess.
Okay. And you've also donated the EXO book bundle, which is in hardcover. Yeah, a signed and personalized first edition of EXO and a signed and personalized first edition of Crossfire. And we have great news. Christina Hemphill from the USA, a huge, great big thank you to you for donating $85 to get Fonda's EXO book bundle. So those babies are going out to Christina soon. They'll be in touch with you soon, Christina, if you're watching this. And the third treat is a 30-minute Skype call for a book club or writing group or fan group or library group. And Gregory Barbie from the USA donated a cool $200 to get it. So Fonda, you're looking forward to meeting Gregory and his class or group, right?
I am.
Yeah. So I'm going to put myself back on screen. So now since there's one treat left, you can go to our Rally Up fundraising page to get the Greenbone Saga book bundle before anyone else does. I'll tell you how to do that at the end of the session. And please give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to end violence against women. And one more note, the Greenbone Saga book bundle is for US donors only. So if you are in the US, better go scramble to get it now. Before someone else does. We've raised $4,670 towards our $5,000 goal. So we are so close. So help us get there. We are just short of $230. Help us get there this weekend. So finally, if you are watching this session on YouTube right now, you will be able to ask Fonda questions live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Shamala, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out live to Fonda to answer. And now we're going to move over to Fonda, who's going to read an exclusive excerpt from Jade War that's coming out next summer, in summer 2019. And just a little heads up that there is a little bit of strong language in there. But otherwise, it's going to be totally action-packed. Let's head over to Fonda. Hey, Fonda, welcome.
Hi, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Good to have you. So onwards to Jade War?
Yes. So Jade War comes out next summer, and I have not read this to anyone. The only people who've seen it so far are my agent, my editor, my husband, and a few beta readers. So this is like hot off the press, if you will. And I picked this scene because I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about today. But a little bit of background. The Drainbone Saga takes place in a secondary fantasy world where magic jade gives certain people the ability to have these superhuman powers. And the island, the fictional island of Kekon, is ruled by a couple of clans. And these clans are in a rivalry with each other, and the story focuses on one family, the Call family. And in this scene, the character that you were going to be hearing from is Hilo. He is the pillar of the clan, and that's the leader of the clan. And the pillar has a couple of second in commands. One is the weatherman, who handles kind of the clan's business and all of its its financial dealings, and then also the horn, who is like the military leader. So this will hopefully become clear in context. But in the scene, Hilo, the pillar, is having he gets people who are here to meet him. So he's having a couple of meetings. And the clan it's the closest analogy to our world would be like kind of imagine a mafia style organization, but they're legitimate, so they're not criminal organizations. This is sort of the way they're structured. Their society is organized. And let me just make sure there's no other like things that'll super confuse you. The people who work under the weatherman are called luckbringers. And the other thing you need to know is Hilo's sister Shay is the weatherman, so she's basically the business arm of the clan. A man and a woman entered. Hilo had never met them before, but he'd heard of their terrible misfortune and knew who they were. Mr. Ian was the co-owner of a local packaging firm and a minor lantern man in the clan. He and his wife had 5 children. The eldest, a girl, was 16 years old. The couple saluted Hilo in silence and sat themselves down woodenly on the sofa across from him. Hilo motioned for Tar to remain in the room, then closed the door before sitting down across from the Ians and inquiring gently, "How's your daughter?" "She'll live," Mr. Ian said hoarsely, and his wife's face trembled with the effort of holding back her emotions. Both of them appeared to be in a state of shock. Hilo motioned for Tar to offer the visitors some water. "Is there anything the clan can do to help your family right now?" Hilo asked. "You don't have to worry about medical expenses. That's already taken care of. Is there anything else you need?" "Vengeance," Mr. Ian whispered fiercely, his voice breaking. "The Espenian dogs who did this deserve worse than death." Hilo had nothing but sympathy for the poor Ian family, but he knew this would be a difficult conversation in which he could not promise everything that he would want to. "The 2 soldiers have been taken into custody by their own government. They're being held in the base on Yumon Island. They can't be touched right now." Mrs. Ian began to cry, and Mr. Ian burst out angrily. "The lawyers say that the Espenians have negotiated for the soldiers to be tried in civil court and to serve their sentence in their home country. They offer us money as compensation for beating and raping my daughter. Money!" Mrs. Ian clutched her husband's arm and wept louder. But Mr. Ian, flushed and maddened, seemed not to notice her as his voice climbed. "The Royal Council can't stand up to the Espenians, but I thought that I could count on the clan to deliver justice. You were the horn, and now you're the pillar. You're supposed to be the fearsome Kal Hiloshidan of No Peak. Are you saying that even you're toothless against these foreigners, these animals?" Hilo gave Mr. Ian a minute to regain control of himself. Then he said, calmly, but a little coldly, "Because of your grief, I'm not offended by anything you say. If these 2 men were Kekanese, they'd already be suffering worse than your poor daughter. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and with all that's happening in the world these days and all the foreign powers our country has to deal with, there are limits on even what the clan can accomplish." Hilo placed a box of tissues in front of Mrs. Ian. "I said those men can't be touched right now. Sometimes we have to wait for justice. But the clan doesn't forget offenses. Let's see what happens. I can't make you any promises, but I'm a parent myself, so you should know that I consider the crime against your family to be unforgivable. Mr. Ian's mouth trembled and he lowered his face. Mrs. Ian wiped her eyes with a handful of tissues. Hilo said, my advice is to take the money that the Espenians offer. Take as much as you can get from them. It may feel like dirty money that's being used to bribe you out of what you really deserve, but don't think of it that way. Let them feel as if they've made amends. That's how their people do it. And use the money to take care of your daughter and the rest of your family. Hilo's tone was kind as he said this, but also firm. Tar showed the heartbroken parents out the door, and the pillar asked for a couple of minutes to be by himself. He felt bad about not being able to give the Ians greater assurances. But the Ertokan War and the large Republic of Espenia military presence on Kekon was like a weeping sore on the bottom of one's foot. It seemed that no one on Kekon, not even the Greenbone clans, could take a single step without feeling it and wincing at the trouble and pain it added to even the simplest tasks. Just last week, following a conversation with Aten in the Double-Double, Hilo had sent Ken to shut down a dozen illegal money changers taking advantage of the foreign servicemen frequenting the casinos on Poor Man's Road, as well as to bolster security in the armpit following a string of drunken incidents. Do you want me to send Hame and the others in, Hilo Gen? Tar asked. Hilo grimaced and was greatly tempted to say no, but he knew that if he did, the other problem waiting outside his door would not go away and would only get worse, which it seemed likely to anyway. Fine, he said. Tar admitted 4 men into the study. One of them was Hame Tumishon, the master luckbringer of the clan. Hilo recognized another as Councilman Koi by his turnip-shaped head. The other 2 were senior lantern men whose names Hilo did not remember offhand. They saluted Hilo respectfully. Mr. Koi said, Kuljen, may the gods continue to shine favor on No Peak. We know you're very busy, especially with 2 small sons at home, so we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us to hear our concerns. You're right, it's been very busy. You all have children, you remember how it is. Thank you for coming to my home instead of forcing me to make the trip to Wisdom Hall or somewhere else. A reminder to everyone in the room that he had not even wanted to take this meeting and had acquiesced only on account of Hame, who he liked and respected. Hilo sat down in one of the armchairs and his guests seated themselves as well. Without any further preamble, Hilo said, So what is it that you're here to ask me? He already knew the answer, but he wanted them to have to speak their minds out loud, to justify themselves to the pillar. The men glanced at each other before Councilman Koi said, Kuljen, it's about your sister. Given the scandalous revelations of her past, she shouldn't continue as weatherman. Why's that? Hilo asked. The councilman looked uncomfortable, but said, I want to say, first of all, that I have absolutely nothing against the weatherman personally. I'm only concerned for the reputation of No Peak. I'm afraid it looks extremely bad for the clan, Kuljen. The main thing is that she was an agent for the Espenian military and sold them information that might have been of national security importance. And today, the Janloon Daily printed an interview with her former lover, an Espenian soldier with Shotarian blood. She was still involved with him while living in Espenia less than 4 years ago. Mr. Koi spread his hands, indicating how self-evident the problem was. How can she be trusted in the second highest position of No Peak? Hilo saw the 2 lantern men nodding along, and he shifted his eyes to Hame. You're sitting in this room as Master Luckbringer, Hame Gen. How many years of experience on the business side of the clan, and have many years of experience on the business side of the clan? In your opinion, is the weatherman running Ship Street badly? Hame glanced at the other men before shifting in his seat and clearing his throat. No, I wouldn't say that. She's made some debatable decisions, but that's not the same thing. But you requested this meeting and you're sitting here, so you agree with them. I share their concerns about the way this affects No Peak's standing, Hame said. Councilman Koi has always advanced the clan's interests in Wisdom Hall, and Mr. Orn and Mr. Aho are 2 of the highest-ranking lanternmen in the clan. When they came to me to request an audience with you, I thought it was important that they hear from you directly. I'm not advocating any specific decision on your part as pillar. Hame might be known for his straightforward honesty, but he was certainly savvy enough not to presume above his rank, nor to speak poorly of his own weatherman in front of people who were not greenbones. Hilo said to the 2 lantern men, You think I should replace the weatherman? Call Jen, said the older of the two men, whom Hilo recognized now as Mr. Iho. This is a purely practical decision. Along with the pillar and the horn, the weatherman is the face of the clan. Since this information about her past has emerged, the press and the public have been questioning if she's still secretly working for the foreigners. They've been calling her Espenia's charm girl. Very crude. The thing is, the Ortocan War has turned opinion against Adamant Capta. The weatherman's past is a problem for No Peak. She could resign and continue to assist the weatherman's office in a less visible role, added Mr. Orne, whom Hilo had recalled recently declared an intention to run for the Royal Council himself. We simply need someone more publicly suitable to be a business leader. Hilo ignored him and said to Mr. Iho, "Who's calling her that?" When the lantern man blinked in confusion, Hilo repeated himself. "Who's been calling my little sister a whore?" "I never said," Mr. Iho stammered, looking suddenly contrite, even a little bit frightened, as if he was just now remembering that Call Hilo had a prior reputation of his own. "Don't bother to answer," Hilo said. "I know who. Aidmat is using the situation to make herself out as a patriot. She's smearing Shay in order to weaken No Peak." "Still, you can't deny the facts," Councilman Cowie argued. "No," Hilo said, "I don't deny them. My sister made some mistakes when she was young, but everyone does. She had a foolish romance with a foreigner, but that's over. And any communication she has with the Espenians these days are for No Peak's gain, on account of the oaths she took to me as pillar. She's doing her job as weatherman. There's no problem." "Call Jen," Mr. Iho exclaimed. "Don't you care how this looks? What people think?" Hilo gave Iho, Orne, and Cowie a briefly withering glance, then laid a hard, flat stare on Hame, as if to say that naturally the others could be forgiven for wasting his time, but he'd expected a greenbone to know better. The pillar was the spine of the clan. He didn't make decisions to please others, certainly not jadeless politicians. Hame's aura drew in, and he said with some defensiveness, "It would be irresponsible for me as Master Luckbringer not to point out the consequences this might have on No Peak and on your own leadership," called Jen. "Your grandfather and most of his comrades are gone. Let the gods recognize them. When people look at Greenbones today, they're not looking at the heroes from the Many Nations War. They're seeing young leaders who grew up with wealth and foreign influences and wondering whether they're green enough to defend the country the way their parents and grandparents did." Hilo leaned forward and swept an unyielding gaze around the circle of men. "My grandfather kept his old crony Yun Dorupan in place as weatherman for decades, long after he should have retired, and no matter how many pubescent girls he fucked. And I didn't see you putting up much of a stink about it. I made the decision to put my sister on Ship Street, and I'm not going to oust her now just because Aidmat is digging up shit and feeding it to the newspapers." He stood up. The meeting was over. Reluctantly, his visitors stood as well. Councilman Cowie and the two lantern men were visibly dissatisfied, saying nothing as they saluted stiffly. Hilo said, "I like that you speak your mind, Hame Jen, as long as you keep using your good sense to serve the weatherman." The Master Luckbringer dipped into a wordless, terse salute and left along with the others. When they were gone, Hilo paced several circles around the study, cursing under his breath. Then he picked up the phone on his desk and dialed the weatherman's office, reaching Shay's secretary. "Tell my sister we need to talk." That is it.
That's awesome. Oops. I think I'm echoing. Can you hear it echoing?
No, you sound all right.
Okay, cool. So everyone, thank you for coming today. If you just joined us, if you have any questions, do make sure you're logged into YouTube and type your questions into the chat box next to the screen. And today's moderator, Shamala, will relay the questions to me. I think we have 2 questions already coming in. And what we do here on Read for Pixels is we have a discussion going about women and girls in Fonda's books, and also sexism and misogyny and all those hot topic questions that are happening right now in the media, and has been happening for the last millennia. And we will mix your questions into that. So we will include your questions as we go along. So everyone ready? Let's do this. So Fonda, what's striking about Jade City and Jade War is the range of complex and well-rounded female characters playing key roles in the very patriarchal culture of the clans. They are not afraid to fight for themselves and or their family, to buck the patriarchal system and to navigate power structures on their own terms. For example, Eight Mother, who ruthlessly seizes power over the Mountain Clan, Call Shay, who only reluctantly returns to No Peak after years away to prove her independence, and Wen, who takes a classic iron fist within the velvet glove approach by acquiring power through her fiancé, now husband, Hilo. So who or what inspires you to create your female characters in this way?
Well, I write books that tend to be very testosterone heavy. So including my YA novels. So my characters include prize fighters in space and teenage soldiers and now these martial arts gangsters. What I want to do within that is to create female characters that live in this very kind of recognizable context, this patriarchal society that we know very well. Even though it's a secondary world, it's so relatable to our own world, but have agency within that. And so they all have to deal with it and struggle with it and find their own path within this context of the greater society. One of the things that I thought about a lot when I was writing the Greenbone Saga is the fact that the gangster genre, if you would, is historically had very few notable female characters. So you think about all the classics that I'm very fond of and that we're familiar with, like The Godfather and Goodfellas and The Untouchables and like all of those. Most of the female characters in the gangster genre, especially in film, tend to be either victims or they are sidelined or they're just not there. And in my mind, there's kind of like a couple of equally wrong ways to portray female characters in a society like that. One is you just do exactly what I think a lot of male authors do, which is you ignore them or you have them as kind of dolls or victims. Or you can, if you are writing a fantasy or science fiction, you can kind of go the opposite direction where you have them just as prevalent as the men, and they're equal to the men, and they're just as tough, and so on. And in my mind, those are equally erroneous because it's not true that women are absent, even in these very violent, testosterone-heavy subcultures. I did a bunch of research when I was writing the Greenbone Saga. And I read like Gangs of New York, and I did all this research into the Sicilian Mafia and the Yakuza. And I discovered all these stories of women who had played roles in organized crime, including, female mafioso in Sicily who've taken over the family business because their husbands are now in jail. Or, there is this gangster in the Five Points in New York during that time period called Hellcat Maggie, who would like fight alongside the men. And there was a female Yakuza boss who took over for her husband briefly. So women are not absent in any part of society. And they play all these different roles. And I think it would be just a complete fallacy to ignore that. At the same time, you have to acknowledge that they face barriers in all those parts of society that they're also a part of. So it's not easy for a character like Aitmata to become the leader of her clan. And so much of her story is wrapped around the fact that she's had to be so ruthless in order to kind of claim the place that is rightfully hers. And Shay basically got sick and tired of all the patriarchy and the sort of the things that she was up against, and left, and has like a challenge coming back and figuring out who she is now. And then of course you've got Wen, as you mentioned, who is trying to wield power, and she has sort of the double challenge of being not just a woman in this world, but a Stone Eye, someone who can't use jade. So how does she overcome that? So for me, it's very important to me that I have female characters that ring true, that have agency, but are also having to work within these constraints and these obstacles and these barriers. Because for me, writing science fiction and fantasy is a way to tell the world as it is. I think some people write it as a form of wish fulfillment, or like, let's try and like write the world I wish it was. My approach has always very much been write the world as I see it. And that includes racism and sexism and patriarchy and politics and all of that.
Yeah. And what's interesting is you mentioned during your Read for Pixels AMA on our fantasy that you are, and I quote, a woman who's always played in male-dominated fields, corporate finance, martial arts, and science fiction. And do you think all this life experience has basically influenced the way you constructed the cultures of your story worlds and the way your female characters navigate the patriarchal structures in them?
I think it definitely has. Because I have seen, I've, like I said, been in a lot of male-dominated fields and have seen the different ways that women kind of navigate those fields and had to do so myself. So I have a lot of that life experience of, being one of the few women in the investment banking club in college and having that sense of, okay, having to trying to fit in, but knowing that I don't fit in. And I think that's something that any woman who is in that sort of situation can relate to, has been through. And so I think that certainly plays a role in how I portray the female characters in my story. Is they're having to be true to themselves, but also like succeed within a certain context. And how do you do that? How do you navigate that kind of old boys club, if you would, and all the systems that are in place, and succeed in your own way, at least, with all of that around you. So I've never kind of like felt as if it was easier or harder to write my female characters. People ask me this sometimes. They ask, well, you tend to write a lot of male characters. Do you find it easier or harder to write male characters than female characters? I don't. I just kind of try to write every character in terms of the context that they're working in and what they're trying to accomplish, and try to make them a fully rounded human being regardless. And with that acknowledgement that if they're a female character in a very patriarchal society, they have a different set of issues that they're dealing with. And that shapes their character in different ways than it does the male characters. One example would be Hilo, who's really, I mean, he's very comfortable in his own skin, because the entire system of that world is set up to make things easy for him, right? He's a man, he's a greenbone, he's like a prince of the Call family. So his outlook on life is very different. His outlook on just everything is very different than his sisters.
Yeah, and and what was apparent in the excerpt that you just read from Jade War is, women in the male-dominated world get judged by double standards, total double standards.
Right, and that's something. There's a couple of conversations that happen in that excerpt that I read, and I chose that excerpt because it illustrated a few things. So the first part is there's foreign presence on this island, and this couple is coming to Hilo because they've suffered this tragedy. Their daughter has been assaulted, and they are looking for vengeance. And Hilo wishes he could give that to them, but he can't. And this particular little conversation happened. I was inspired to write it for a couple of reasons. The first is that it is an analog to some of the relations that the United States in particular had with the occupation of Okinawa and Japan post-World War II. And several years ago, there were incidents in which American soldiers stationed at foreign bases had sexually assaulted and raped local women. And the outcry, not just the outcry, but also the international tension that resulted, in that. So that had like, there was a historical analog that I was bringing into that. But the other analog the other thing that was driving that little bit was the opening scene of The Godfather. So anyone who's read the series knows that there are parts of it that are inspired by my love of The Godfather. And the opening scene of The Godfather is the Godfather having this conversation with a petitioner who has come to him because his daughter was beaten, and the justice system has let him down. These two people who harmed his daughter have gotten off scot-free, and he's come to the Godfather asking for help, for vengeance, basically. And this scene really has kind of stuck with me. It's so iconic in that movie and in that book, because it sets up this extrajudicial character, the Godfather, who's basically a criminal, as a good guy, because he's able to give justice to someone for whom the justice system has failed them. And it's interesting and very, unsurprising that it's a case of a woman who's being assaulted. And that kind of speaks to this overall just acknowledgement that most of the time, women who are assaulted don't get justice. And that creates this level of sympathy for these fictional gangsters who you might otherwise be like, well, they're not good people. But here they're acting in a sympathetic manner because they're kind of doing the thing that we, the audience, and the people who are victims in the story wish could be done to the people who visit harm on those women. So that's one part of the scene. The other part is that conversation with the councilmen, who are obviously there to try and get Hilo to oust Shay because of these allegations about her past, which is very recognizable from stuff that goes on in our own world, right? That women are held to this different standard of leadership and they can't make any mistakes, and that Hilo kind of sums it up at the end of that scene where he basically says, hey, the previous weatherman, he did all this other stuff that is far worse, and and you guys didn't make a stink about it then. But now that it's a woman in the role, here you are in my office. So those two conversations kind of highlight things that are very recognizable in our own world, but are obviously having an impact on the characters in the story.
Yeah. And when you write your female characters, we've come across this before. We've talked about this with other female Read for Pixels authors before. Do you ever feel pressured by gender and cultural stereotypes, and to make your female characters likable or relatable? Do you get any flack because a female character is not likable enough?
I don't, because I don't make making likability a priority when I write. To me, I want all the characters to be equally fleshed out and three-dimensional, and to have very human flaws. And especially in the Greenbone saga, all of these characters have moral shades of gray. Aitmata is not a likable person, but yeah, she is that way for a reason, and she has reasons for believing what she does and acting the way that she does. And I think likability is an overrated quality in fictional characters in general, especially in female characters, but in general. Readers don't need your characters to be likable. They need them to be interesting, and they need to understand why they're doing the things that they do. I think it's less important that they be good people or likable people, because you don't like everyone that you know in your own life. People are different. You don't have to like this character, but you have to understand why that character is acting the way they are. And I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind when you're writing male or female characters. I wouldn't be surprised if female characters in general get more flack for doing a lot of the things that male characters do.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we have a question from the audience. Jim Finn says, your world building is a big part of the appeal of JADE City. The question I have is, how do you hold back from spinning out into a super complex world explanation and keep focused on the characters? And is that a difficulty for you? If not, what is the most challenging thing for you with writing the series?
It is not really a challenge for me to keep the world building from spinning out of control. I love world building. I'm a world building junkie. I've written, I think 3 different worlds across my 4 books. So I love that process of coming up with the new world, building the new world. I think one of the things that helps me is when it comes to world building and integrating it into the narrative is being very focused on what the story is. And I think I get that from writing young adult fiction. So I wrote I was published in young adult fiction before I was published in adult fiction. And there I have to be very economical and very focused on the story and the pacing and the point of view of this one main character. And that makes me, has built up the skill of writing tight. So even though when I write my adult novels, which have much larger word count, it's a trilogy, it's got a lot more intense world building, it has a lot more characters, that kind of focus on writing tight and always having my eye on the ball in terms of what does the narrative need, what does the reader need to know, helps a lot. There's like so much world building in the books, but it's all about moving the story forward and giving the reader the information they need to know when they need to know it, as opposed to giving them everything you want them to know because it's cool. So world building is something I really enjoy. I don't find it hard to integrate it into the narrative. The hardest thing about writing this trilogy is probably just the sheer ambitiousness of it, because it is a big story and it's focused on this family, which also keeps it tight narratively, because I'm not kind of going off in 1,000 different directions, and I don't have, characters, spread out too widely because they're all connected. But it will, by the time it's over, it's going to have covered a lot of characters connected to the clans over a substantial amount of time. So just even keeping track of when everything happens and what's going on with different people in different places and making sure all these different subplots weave together is a lot like handling, it's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube, and as soon as you move something, something else moves. So it's just the scope and the complexity of the different elements and all the different plots and all the different characters. And it's overwhelming at times, but somehow it all comes together. Somehow it all works in the end.
Yeah. So let's talk violence and writing violence. You've addressed sexual violence in JADE City, and Shay discovers evidence that the old weatherman Doru is a pedophile and has sexually assaulted and raped a classmate. And true to many real life situations, Doru is not punished for being a rapist, but for betraying the clan. So why did you decide to approach the topic this way?
To me, I think you answered it. It's true to life. It is. And it also puts a chink in the armor of Carl Sen, who's the patriarch. He's the grandfather, and he's really he's a war hero, and he's basically he's the granddad to all the main characters, and he's lauded as being this fantastic guy. But his best friend is a pedophile, and he's protected him for all these years. And on one hand, it also signals to the reader, hey, like, this isn't a story of good guys versus bad guys, right? This is within this clan. This is the clan that we're following. This family has its own darknesses and its own secrets and its own sins. And even this character, even this granddad, who everyone in the country thinks is a hero, and he's founded the clan and he's built K-Con, he protects. He protects his friend who's committed these terrible things. And I think there's a scene in the book where Shay says that that's the one time when she realized that Doru had cost her true admiration of her grandfather. And that, again, that rings very true to life to me. There are people who have achieved amazing things, who are very accomplished, who we admire, but who turn a blind eye to some of those evils, for whatever reason. You look at all the people who knew about Harvey Weinstein, who knew about Kevin Spacey, right? Great, accomplished actors, but that it's like so many things in our own world. People get away with it, and pretty much everything I ever write in any of my fantasy worlds, any of my science fiction worlds, is does this feel true to life? Does it ring true? Can I believe that this happened? And to me, there's so much moral grayness in the world and in every issue that I try to bring that to my story. So Doru is this, he's clearly an unlikable character, but they have to deal with him. He's in the family. He's valuable to the family. He's like the best friend of their grandfather. He's their uncle. So these things are, and I think that's also true to life, that these are this kind of abuse and the things that happen. They're not like out there. They're people that a lot of us know, that we might interact with on a regular basis. And everyone's always shocked when the allegations come up and stuff, but most of the time they don't. Most of the time people don't know. And that's how you hear that all the time, right? Like people find out that someone close to them has been abused by someone else that they know, and they don't.
It's either they don't know or they don't want to know.
Right. Or they don't believe it because their knowledge of that person is in contradiction.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and, with the Me Too movement happening now, what's happened in the US for the past few days, past couple of weeks, really, with regard to, not going to name him here, not going to give him the benefit of being named, but the current candidate, the Supreme Court of the United States. This topic has been coming up over and over again since Me Too broke, and it's accelerated since this since this current assessment of the current candidate for the open slot in the Supreme Court. And how many of you, basically, if you go on Facebook, go on Twitter, people are saying, this is why I didn't tell. How many people knew? They knew. So many people said, my mother knew, my dad knew, my friend knew, my granddad knew, my teacher knew, my coach knew. They didn't do anything about it. And if I said anything, I was going to get, what Dr. Blasey Ford is now facing in public. They get it in all different ways. So, either they didn't know, or they didn't want to know. And in Doru's case, I think Shay didn't know, right, until she found the pictures. But Lan and Hilo knew, didn't they? Or did they also not know?
Yeah, so that's very up to debate question whether or not they knew. I think it's pretty clear. I mean, from even the passage that I just read, that Hilo certainly knew. So maybe after the fact, maybe before. So I think it's one of those open secrets, right? That and also Doru's victim in this case was in a vulnerable position because Doru is the weatherman. He makes the decisions about which businesses in the clan get funding. So he decides whether her family's business gets funded, and so he's in a position where he doesn't he can abuse his power. And you can see that parallel very much, right?
With Weinstein, because so many actresses said, I didn't say anything because he could literally destroy my career if I said anything. So, it is, like you said, it is true to life. And, the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in fantasy books. Whether it's epic fantasy, urban fantasy, space opera, paranormal romance. Do you think this is an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling successfully in recent years?
I think there's certainly more of an awareness of it. And I think there's certainly some tropes out there that bear closer examination as a result of increased awareness, right? Like you think of, I think of Dragon Riders of Pern, which was like a series that I loved when I was a teenager. And there's definitely some scenes in that series where the issue of consent is not fully fleshed out. You can definitely see that there's an argument to be made that the line between coercion and consent is very shaky. But I think the awareness now is at least causing people to examine, certainly writers to kind of examine how they approach the things they write. And I think sometimes, that even the fact that line between coercion and consent is fuzzy is an issue that we're dealing with. So in that sense, that is also true to life, but we're also realizing that fuzzy line is a danger zone. And it's a danger zone in real life, and therefore a danger zone to characters in fiction as well. I certainly think that, at least in the science fiction fantasy genre, there are all those, like, there's such a history of misogyny in the genre in general, right? There's a lot. If you go back and you read stuff that was classics 20 or 30 years ago, and you see so much.
You kind of cringe, right? You kind
of stuff that I loved as a teenager. I read Piers Anthony as a teenager. Now I read oh my goodness, like, do you just say that, right? So there's stuff that we just didn't really, and all just at that time it went right over my head. Partly because I was a teenager, partly because we didn't have that awareness, we weren't thinking about those things. So things are certainly changed. It doesn't mean that we can't still love our problematic faves, and but I think in the last few years, certainly, that there's been, because of these open conversations.
There's kind of like a feedback loop now, right? Audiences are more aware, and so they hold creators more responsible for what you put on a page, what you show in film, what you show in your performances. They do have an influence on people, because pop culture is this massive thing now, especially with the internet, where people have fandom groups and they have all sorts of fan fiction, huge fan fiction community and all. And it is it is so much soft influence out there now. And this is why we have Read for Pixels, because stories are so important. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But we have one more question to do with this issue about violence and writing violence. So for writers who want to write about violence against women without falling into toxic tropes such as fridging or reducing a female character to a one-dimensional catalyst for what Chuck Wendig, whom we all love, calls, and I quote, air quotes here, man pain, what would your advice be?
For writing violence against women in a thoughtful way, I think it's all about your narrative necessity and knowing what you're doing, being intentional about what you're doing. I think a lot of the tropes come out of shortcuts, if you will, like a sort of falling back on what's easy to do. I was recently on a panel where we talked about a similar issue, which was the killing of marginalized and minority characters, right? Like the like black guy dies first, or that sort of trope, right? And I think the misperception is that, oh, well, now we can't ever do that, oh, you can't ever kill, people will get hung up and say, like, what are you saying? Like, you can't ever kill minority characters? No, of course not. Like, you can, right? You can. And the same thing, like, I would never say you can't write violence against women. I write violence constantly. So to say you can't write violence against women is ludicrous. But what you need to be able to do is make sure that you're not doing it in a way that that's basically lazy, if you will. So a lot of, I think, violence against women is portrayed in a way that is just, it's a shortcut to get another character to do something else, if you will, right? Like a lot of fridging is, oh, the main character's girlfriend has been killed, and so now he has to go and get revenge, or what have you. And if you're going to write violence against women, I think you need to ask yourself, is it necessary to the story? And if it is, because it very well might be, then how do you handle it in a way that is that doesn't minimize it or make it just a trope to move the narrative along for a male character? So this is the same thing with the minority characters who get killed off, right? If you kill off a minority character, if your minority character is being killed off because someone needs to die, and you can't kill off your main white character and you just kill off your minority character instead, that's a problem, because your minority character is like, especially if they're like the only minority character, you have a character who's standing in for an entire group, and that's a problem. But if you have like a whole host of different minority characters and the danger is like at least equitable throughout for them, it's different. So it's the same with, like, I think violence against women. If you have a female character, she's the only female character of note who gets a speaking role, and she dies, and the reason she dies is so that the male characters can then go off and do something, then you're just falling into tropes. So I think that it's a lot of just, are you being deliberate and intentional? Are you handling it in a way that feels authentic and doesn't diminish the experience of the character who's actually going through the violence?
Yeah, and sort of a related question to that would be, if you are writing about violence against women, how do you strike a balance between making sure that people know that it is not good, raising awareness about it, while telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
I don't really feel like I worry about being pedantic or preachy. I try to just get out of the way of the story.
Yeah.
I think you should not be able, for me personally, and other authors may feel differently, for me personally, I don't want the audience to feel as if my author voice is being inserted with my opinions. I want to get out of the story. I want to have the interesting characters do the interesting things, and get out of their way. And I don't linger. I treat both sex and violence in my novels in a pretty direct, straightforward, kind of unsentimental way. So I write a lot of violence. I write sex, and I'm just kind of like, I treat it very with sort of the same degree of just bluntness and kind of letting it be part of the story and getting out of it. So I don't linger. I don't linger unnecessarily on those to either wallow in it or to kind of like push the horror of it into anyone's face. To me, I'm telling a story, and I'm telling a story about characters, and the more I can just tell it, and without inserting any sort of outside influence, the more true it will feel, the more easily, hopefully, the reader can sink into the world.
Yeah, and you write, your characters are mostly men. I mean, do you think reframing stories or how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways that science fiction and fantasy writers can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
So I definitely have a soft spot for my toxically masculine characters. I write a lot of characters who are, they are stereotypically toxic masculinity in a sense, because they're, I write characters who are soldiers and gangsters and prize fighters, and there's a lot of masculinity, toxic and otherwise, in some of my characters. I think it's important to make sure you have a wide you have to portray different types of characters and different types of masculinity. So it's not to say you can't ever have that kind of stereotypically like tough, unemotional, a violent character anymore, but you need to show like a range of characters, and you also need to make the characters that you do have as nuanced as you can. And one of the ways I think about this is the status of your characters in the worlds that they live in. Nobody is ever one way consistently through their whole life, right? We have multiple people that we're interacting with. The way that you relate to your children is different than the way that you relate to your coworkers, which is different from the way that you relate to your colleagues, which is different from the way that you relate, to your parents. So everyone has a different relationship. And if you can show your characters with kind of a full breadth of relationships, I think that humanizes them more. So, we have this tendency, I think, especially with male characters, to kind of almost make them one note. Like the male hero is always like tough and good at fighting and doesn't show emotions, and like, so that's like sort of a one note character. But it's even the most violent characters in the stories I write have vulnerabilities and have flaws and relate to different people, are in different sort of status positions at different times. So like I have a character, Lon, who's a character in my novel, is the leader of the clan. And so he has to have this sort of authority and this very masculine presence, and he's a greenbow, so he's a fighter, but he is, he's also suffered through a divorce, and he's dealing with insecurity about whether he can fill his grandfather's footsteps, and he's very sweet to his sister. And Hilo, who is a very sort of impetuous, hot-headed character, he's kind of the least favored grandchild, so he deals with that, and he has this very sweet relationship with his girlfriend. So like they have different, I think having that range of relationships within characters, but then also a variety of different examples of masculinity is important, because it's not about just, I don't think it's as simple as just combating it, as opposed to breaking apart our definition of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And we were talking about geek culture just now. So, geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male-dominated, despite a rising number of prominent, well-respected, and well-known female authors and creators. Plus, there's still plenty of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks and anyone who's not male. And what do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books, more welcoming for women and girls?
I think the tide is shifting. This is one area where I'm honestly very hopeful. I see so much more. When I was a teenage girl, I did not feel as if there was room in geek culture for girls. I still remember being made fun of for liking Transformers and things like that.
Really?
Yeah.
Was it the boys who made fun?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember wanting to play Transformers, and the boys would kind of leave me out and be like, "You're a girl, you don't like Transformers." So I remember that. I feel like it has changed. The tide has turned in my opinion. There's so many female authors working in the field now, and I mean, you look at the nominees for major awards. There's so many women who are working in the field doing amazing things. It is still, you still see the imbalance in terms of the male authors getting the bulk of publicity and marketing and so on in the industry as a whole. But I do think part of the issue is time. I think that where we're in a point, hopefully, where the next generation is not kind of growing up with the same sort of internalized expectations that we did. And I also think, the visibility is a huge part, right? That there's just, I'll give you an example. When I was a teenager, I didn't know any female Asian American authors. The only one I knew of was Amy Tan. That was it. So I don't think I ever grew up feeling as if it was a viable career for me. I think this next generation sees a lot more female creators, minority creators, and I think that will have a huge impact. In terms of the culture, I think honestly, it's like it's just this slow evolution, the progress of. But I think a lot of it is we're kind of almost in this situation where there's been so much progress that there's a backlash, and so those things are like they're butting up.
It's kind of like these male geeks running around shouting, "You ruined my childhood!"
Right.
Dude, your childhood's been and gone. You're like,
yeah.
35 or 40 or 55 years old. It's long gone,
Right. Yeah, they have to realize that the stuff that's being created now it's fine that it's not for them. New generations of kids have to be introduced to the genre, and that's more important than catering to your childhood. So I think that's sort of inevitable that we're going to get that. But I think there's just a general movement that's overall positive, and it's a matter of more visibility, more championing of female creators, more acknowledgement that I will say I actually think that I find there to be possibly even more of an issue in the YA space where I work as well, because we're still very gendered with kids. We still have situations where, parents, librarians will hesitate to give a book with a female main character to a young male reader because they'll be like, "Oh, that book is for girls," or so which is frustrating to no end. I mean, my son reads books with female characters and male characters. It doesn't. I think the more that we can expose, young male readers and young female readers to protagonists and works with both male and female protagonists and by both male and female creators, we're going to overcome that. But I still see it. I still see, teachers and librarians who I'll bring my son in to, look for book recommendations, and they'll automatically assume he doesn't want to read about female characters.
Yeah. And, I'm a teacher myself. I teach in the evenings, and I teach kids to read, and I teach them English. And the one thing I notice is that, that these kids are between the age of 12 and 17. I give them female, books by Holly Black, books by Kimberly Durden. I give them a whole mix of different books, female characters, male characters. They don't really care. What they care about is this a great story that I can get lost in, that I really like, They're like Wonder Woman. The boys like Wonder Woman,
Right.
right? So, you know, it's the grown men who are making so much noise about all this. You know, it's the grown-ups, not just romance. The grown-ups are making a big deal about these gender divides and trying to enforce it. And it is kind of, oh, come on, let's just move to the next stage with the kids. And that kind of brings me to the penultimate question for today, which you partly answered, which are, you know, parents are usually the most influential role models in a person's life. So as a mom yourself, what do you think parents can do to help prevent violence against women and girls in future generations and to get boys involved in helping to do so?
I think it's having conversations with them, honestly. I think, I mean, the stuff that's going on in the news right now, they're not deaf to that. You know, they're hearing about what's going on in the news, and those are actually opportunities to have those conversations. I think fiction is actually a great vehicle for parents and for teachers to broach some of those conversations, and to talk about some of those issues with kids. So I honestly think that, you know, that sheltering kids, like I run into this a lot. You know, books, YA books, that can't go through the school market because they have sexual content, or, you know, whatever. Because there's definitely parents who would rather just shelter kids from all mention of like sex altogether, and that doesn't do anyone any favors, because, you know, the reality is kids are online these days. They can have access to anything. So, you know, I've heard I've heard teachers say that, you know, they have situations or where no one talks to young men about sexual consent, and so their first, like, their education is basically looking up porn on the internet, which is like a completely unrealistic and wrong way to learn about anything. But that's the fact that kids have so much access to stuff online these days. They're going to find it out. They hear it from their friends, they find it online, and parents kind of have to get in ahead of that and be willing to have those conversations.
Yeah. And, you know, if you don't have those, like you said, if you don't have those conversations, that's going to do a lot of damage, not just to, you know, that's not going to do your kid any favors. And somewhere down the line, your kid might even grow up to hurt other people, you know, and have a dysfunctional view of how they are supposed to relate to the people that they are romantically or sexually attracted to. And that leads to a lot of horrible, horrible things that we're now talking about with the Me Too movement going on. And so there's one more question from the audience, and we have a final question, and then we'll do wrap up. Jim Finn asks, he says, you spoke about the shifting status positions of your characters. Is that something that comes naturally to you now in the scene?
I'm not sure if anything comes naturally in writing, honestly. I think everything in writing has to be very deliberate, because you go through this manuscript so many times, and by the end, you have to feel confident that every word is in its right place. I'm not sure if it comes naturally so much as it's something I think about, and is a way that I think about developing relationships between my characters, because I think when I have a cast of characters like I do with the Greenbone Saga, I have the opportunity to have characters viewed from different angles. So the way Hilo views himself is different from the way Shay views him, is different from the way Ben views him, right? And so you get this triangulation effect where you can have these different point of view characters, and the way that they relate makes them more real because they're being fleshed out from different points of view. So the shifting status thing is a way that I think about making those characters more authentic, because, you know, I'll go into a scene and I'll be like, okay, this is a scene where you know, Shay and Hilo are having a conversation. There's a certain dynamic that they have that's built up over a childhood together, that I have to be sure to try and capture. Well, as Hilo talking to, make Tar, who's his classmate and his subordinate, is a very different dynamic. So that's something that that is always sitting in the front of my mind when I do those dialogue, when I write dialogue. And I think it really comes through when you're writing dialogue, and when you're writing, so much of a story is conveyed in dialogue and in relationships.
So we're down to the last question of the day, which is a Captain Obvious question, but we ask this of every author that we have on as a guest on Read for Pixels. You have been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. Why do you support the cause to end violence against women, and what do you think authors can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
Well, I'm supportive honestly, because it's the right thing to do. There are a few perks to being an author, and one of them is people actually sometimes listen to you, and they read what you write. So I think one of the ways that authors can help is by using that platform, using that voice, and doing events like this, honestly, because we often do feel helpless. I think when we hear the news and we hear about these situations, there's not a lot that we feel like we can do. And I'm an author as a career, so I besides donating to worthy causes, I don't feel like I can personally go join a nonprofit and work on the front lines, but I can use the platform that I do have to raise that awareness and to talk about it. And it's also just the fact that we are in this point in history, right, where it's an evergreen issue, if you will, right? We have had these conversations in the past. We are still having these conversations. We will probably almost certainly continue to have these conversations in the future. So, what we can do is hope that those conversations change over time, that we are making some steps in our society to advance those conversations. So, I think also, I write a lot of, I'm a female author and I write a lot of violence. So I write violence, but I also want to be able to kind of make a difference in terms of like real life violence. Fictional violence in my mind is great and entertaining and fun, but real life violence is something that we still struggle with, and oftentimes don't know what to do about, and how we can help reduce it. So that's it. That's why I'm here.
Okay, so I'm going to put myself back on screen so we can do wrap up. Hi guys, thank you so much for joining us today. As mentioned earlier, Fonda has generously donated 3 lovely treats to the stash of author goodies that we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels fundraising page. And I'm going to share a slide pretty soon. Hang on, here we go. All right, here we go. Fonda, can you see the slide?
I can.
Okay, so Fonda has donated 1 Greenbow Saga book bundle, which includes 1 signed and personalized first edition trade paperback of Jade City, and 1 signed and personalized advanced reader copy of Jade War once it's available. Jade War is coming out in summer 2019. She's also donated 1 EXO book bundle. This is a pair of hardcovers, which include the first signed and personalized first edition of EXO and a signed and personalized first edition of Crossfire, and 1 30-minute Skype call for a book club or library group or writing group or fan group. All books in the book bundles are signed and personalized by Fonda and are available to US donors only. The Skype calls are available to donors worldwide, but limited to groups only. And as mentioned before, the EXO book bundle and Skype group session has now been snapped up by some very generous donors. So there's only 1 treat left from Fonda. Go get the Greenbow Saga book bundle before someone else does. And if you see on screen, there's the slide there, you can go to is.gd/R4P Rally Up 2018. It's case sensitive. So make sure that you hit all those caps at the right places. And to find out more about Read for Pixels, you can go to is.gd/Read4Pixels. And you know, if you get to the fundraising page and Fonda's last bundle is gone, we have so many more goodies left. We have Richard K. Morgan with lots of rare books, Callie Link, Sarah Beth Durst, Brandon Sanderson has a couple of book bundles left, and Brandon is sending those worldwide. So if you're a big epic fantasy fan, you better run over to the fundraising page and get them before the final two go. Adrian Tchaikovsky, Karen Rose, Ilya Deboda, and more. There are lots of Skype calls, lots of books, lots of art, actually. Fonda, lots of art.
Cool.
Yeah, some really cool hand-drawn art and knitted goodies. That's the cold season coming up. So, you know, winter's coming soon. So, you know, if you guys also want to find out more about the Pixel Project, you go to www.thepixelproject.net. And on our website, you can find out a whole lot about different types of violence against women. It's not just domestic violence, rape, and sexual assault. There are so many, I think 16 or 17 types. We have downloadable lists that you can use if you are a victim and you want to escape your abuser, or if you are a friend or family member of the victim and you want to help the victim. We have all sorts of checklists there as well that you can use. And you know, once again, to find out more about the Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign, please visit reveal.thepixelproject.net to learn more about it. And please do donate generously to help us reveal pixels and raise funds for the cause. Now I'm going to put Fonda back on screen so we can say bye. And Fonda, do you have any announcements? Do you have any events coming up later this year?
I am going to be touring in California in October, so I'll be at Town Center Books in San Francisco and Mysterious Galaxy in Los Angeles, so I will be there. I will be at World Fantasy in November, and I believe at Oricon also later in November. And then other than that, I'm just writing more books. The Greenbone Saga, and the next one comes out. Jade War comes out summer next year.
Has it gone? Has the manuscript gone to the publisher yet, or
it's sitting on my editor's desk right now?
Wow! Everybody, set your calendars for next up. Is it July or June?
I'm not sure what the official launch date is yet. They haven't given that to me yet, so it'll probably be, I don't know, around June.
Okay, so everyone, thank you so much for being with Fonda and us today. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world.
Thanks, everyone.